Our first speaker today, February, you may or may not know that February is National Pesticide Safety Education Month. And so we have two great talks lined up today related to using pesticides as safely as possible. Our first speaker is Dan Wickstead. He's an extension educator with the Cornell Pesticide Safety Education Program, which is also part of New York State Integrated Pest Management. And he is my go-to person whenever I have questions about pesticides and mitigating risks. So today he'll be talking with us about proper storage of pesticides and household chemicals. And go ahead, Dan.
Hi, good afternoon. So before we get started, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. I want to define two terms, pest and pesticide, because a lot of people think that pest just means insects. But a pest is actually any living thing that has an undesirable impact on something that's important to us. So while some insects are pests, so are weeds, plant pathogens, rodents, and disease-causing bacteria and viruses. That means a pesticide isn't just something that kills insects. Okay, a pesticide is a substance that kills or repels any pest that we might be concerned about. So you can see here we have rodenticides, disinfectants, things like that. So I'm going to put up a slide here with 12 fairly common household products you can get at a grocery store or hardware store. And just take a look at these for a minute and ask yourself which of these products are pesticides. I'll just give you a minute to look at them. The fact is that all of these are pesticides because each of them is used to kill or repel some kind of a pest, whether again it's something to protect our house, our food, keep bacteria from growing on our dishes, anything like that. These are all pesticides. Now, if we look at some label warnings on common products that you might have in your home, you can see very quickly, quick glance tells you, you gotta store these out of reach of children, okay? And look at some of the label warnings under product A, it causes eye irritation. Product B, if you're breathing the vapor, it can cause dizziness, headache, or nausea. Look over to C, it says, keep it out of your eyes, harmful if ingested. Product D mentions it's corrosive. That means that it gets in your eyes, it can cause eye corrosion, can damage your eyes on contact. So you can see you want to be careful with how you store these products, but what a quick glance doesn't show you is that these products aren't pesticides. They're just common household products. We have a floor cleaner, mineral spirits, nail polish remover, and a product used to get rid of hard water deposits. And the reason I'm telling you this is to remind you that pesticides aren't that unique as far as having them around the house and having to be careful with them. Okay, all household chemicals are toxic to some degree and pose risks. Some, like the ones that I showed you, might pose more risk than pesticides you have around the house. So you want to store all household chemicals properly. And while I'll focus my talk today about storing pesticides, you'll see that some of the lessons will apply to other household chemicals as well. But one good thing about pesticides is their product labels are a lot more detailed than other chemicals you have around the house, and they'll give you more exact instructions about storing pesticides. Okay, so every pesticide label will have a section on storage and disposal. And one thing they'll all say is store pesticide in the original container. This is important for two reasons. First, that original container has a label attached to it or printed on the container that identifies what the contents are and how to use it. If you end up pouring this insecticide into some other container, you don't have the label. So in a week or two, you're likely going to forget what you put in that container, what it is. And even if you remember, oh yeah, that's our ortho insect killer, you won't have the label that tells you how to use it properly. And one thing I have to mention, we want you to store pesticides in the original container never even for a moment store them in any kind of food container. Okay, it sounds like obvious advice, but we often see this. People put pesticides in a food container and then other people, especially children, have been poisoned. They will see something in one of these, an old juice container, think it's something to drink, and they'll drink it. The label will also tell you to store pesticide in a cool, dry area away from heat or open flame, and to keep them from freezing. The reason for this is simple, okay? These temperature extremes can actually degrade the pesticide product. If a liquid pesticide freezes, all the ingredients that are supposed to be mixed together well will separate. And so when you go to use the product, it's not going to work as well. And if you have pesticide exposed to too much heat, too much temperature, high temperature, the pesticide can actually degrade. The chemical will degrade and not work as well. Other problems are when a container freezes, it becomes more brittle and it can rupture. So then when the product thaws out, now you have a hole in the container and you end up with a spill. On the opposite extreme, liquids expand at high temperatures. And so you might get a liquid pesticide expanding inside a container, causing pressure. So when you go to open that container, the liquid will spray out because it's now under pressure, and that can cause exposure. So if you have a basement, a great place to store pesticides is in a metal cabinet such as this. Always store them. This cabinet's gonna have multiple shelves. Don't store them on the bottom because a lot of basements we're going to get moisture on the floor. Floor could get wet. Sometimes they flood a little bit, and you don't want the pesticide to get wet in any way, shape, or form. Granular or dust pesticides that get wet will cake, and then they won't be able to be applied properly. Also, the container can get damaged. The label might soak up water and then become illegible. So never store pesticides on the ground, whether or not they're in a cabinet. Another thing the label is going to say is store the pesticides in an area inaccessible to children and pets. This is obviously something you want to do with all the household chemicals. So again, if you have the luxury of a basement and a metal cabinet like this, a keyed lock will do the job of keeping it out of reach of children and pets. A lot of people don't have this luxury though, and so they might store pesticides in a cabinet, say under the sink or someplace else. If you do that, use child-safe cabinet locks, okay? Again, to keep kids from getting to the pesticides. It's the same, if under your bathroom sink, you have all these cleaners and stuff, use these child-safe locks. This also keeps pets out. When my kids were growing up, they had a pet cat who could get into any cabinet in our house. She could also open most drawers in the house. So we had to keep things locked just to keep the cat out, even though the kids were old enough to know not to go into these areas. And wherever you store your pesticides, I like to store mine in a clear plastic tub. I can put a few products into a tub like this. You can get them at local hardware stores. The nice part is, if anything does happen, if a container gets a rupture in it, or if it tips over and spills, you can detect that right away. Okay, if you just put these pesticides on a shelf in the storage cabinet and then a leak happened, the entire shelf is going to get dirty. It's going to drip down onto other shelves and contaminate everything underneath it. Same thing under your cabinet. So this is a really great way of being proactive and preparing for the potential spill or leak. It's a lot less easier to clean up. Now, a lot of people are going to store their pesticides out in the garage or a yard shed. And that's a poor choice for storing pesticides simply because these areas are subject to temperature extremes. And it's also a place where you're going to have your kids are going to store their bikes, lawn games, sports equipment. And you want pesticides to be an area where kids are not going. Okay. So if all possible, don't store your pesticides in a, 'a, 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 ' That shed garage though is an option for storing large pesticide application equipment such as a lawn spreader. You're not gonna be able to fit that in a storage cabinet or in a cabinet under your sink. So if you do have this kind of equipment, just clean it out after each use. So there's less likelihood for exposure for somebody going into the cabinet or going into the shed where it's located. Now, not all pesticides are chemicals. Some are living bacteria or fungi. BT is a common example used to kill a lot of caterpillars. So labels can require more precise storage conditions for that product to remain viable. Example of this one, it tells you activity may be impaired by storage at temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can see why putting it in a garden shed would not be a good choice. We get an August day where it's 92, 93 degrees. That pesticide could now become non-viable and it becomes waste, and you don't want that. So generally you store pesticides separate from anything else. That's just a safe rule of thumb. But there's some things you can store with pesticides. First is any measuring cups or utensils you use to measure out pesticide. You can store that with your pesticides, but also as it's shown here, write the word pesticide on that measuring cup. Okay, so there's no chance of using it in the kitchen. You would never want to use this in the kitchen. You can use it only once with pesticides. Small application equipment, a pump sprayer, if that can fit, say in that storage cabinet, you can store that with pesticides. If not, go ahead and put it out in the shed or garage. But again, write pesticides on it and flush it out with water before you store it. So again, there's less chance of exposure. And empty pesticide containers can be stored with pesticide. Another pesticide waste I'll talk about later. One thing about empty containers, don't reuse them for any other purpose. It can be tempting. Some of these are nice, sturdy plastic jugs. You might want to use them for something else, but you can never fully clean these. And so you don't want to expose people to them by using them for any other purpose. Things you don't want to store with pesticides include personal protective equipment. That might seem strange. Well, if I want to wear these rubber gloves and I'm using pesticides, why wouldn't I store them with the pesticides? Well, if there is a spill where you have the pesticides and the glove gets contaminated, you're not going to be able to wear it. You want to use some protective equipment to clean up that spill, but you won't be able to use the gloves anymore. So that can cause a problem. So the personal protective equipment, you keep in a clean area away from the pesticides. Things like garden seed, potting soil, and fertilizer, you also want to keep separate. Again, if there's a spill or even just fumes get into these products, that could stop the seed from germinating. If you have any kind of a herbicide fume or spills getting into potting soil or fertilizer, that could adversely affect the plants that are grown using that potting soil or fertilizer. And things like wild bird food. Again, something you might use in the garden. Keep away from pesticides, but you certainly don't want to expose birds to anything that might have spilled in the pesticide area. I always get questions, what about weed feed? It contains herbicide and fertilizer, right? Ideally, you want to store this separately from other pesticides and other fertilizers, which can be tough. And bags may be hard to store inside. A lot of these are 14-pound, maybe larger, might be, again, hard to fit in a cabinet or under the, in a storage cabinet or under the sink, something like that. So my advice for weed feeds is buy only what you need right before you make the application. Okay, these are used in lawns. So measure how big a lawn area you want to treat. Go to the store, buy just enough to treat that area, come back and use it that same day. That way you're not storing it for any length of time. You might have a little bit left over in a bag, but that's going to be easier to store than a 14-pound, a bunch of 14-pound bags. Now, if you're going to use pesticide, you're going to end up with waste. You can't avoid it. Okay. One thing you certainly are always going to end up with is empty pesticide containers. But you can also end up with damaged product. Those spray insecticides, an aerosol can. The nozzles might break off. That happens every now and then. Happens to me a lot with like air fresheners or spray disinfectants. That nozzle breaks off and now you can't get the pesticide out. Or if an insecticide dust was exposed to moisture and got caked, and now it can't be used. And there's also leftover unwanted product. Okay, now you can't really do anything about pesticide empty pesticide containers. You're gonna end up with those. But damaged or unwanted product you can reduce. First, buy only what you need for the job at hand. Be careful about bargains. A lot of times a pesticide concentrate seems like a better deal over a ready-to-use product because it'll cost less per application. But that concentrate might be able to treat a really big area, maybe a full acre or a third of an acre. And if you don't want to treat that much area, then you're just going to end up with unwanted product that becomes waste. Write the purchase date on a container and use older product first. So if you do go out and get another aerosol can, one's getting low and you want to buy another aerosol can, write the date on them and use that older one first. The longer pesticide is in storage, the more time it has for the chemicals to degrade and become less effective. There's no real set timeline on that. It's hard to find out how long, but basically you don't want to keep pesticides lying around for a long time. And the other way to reduce waste is to store them properly. If you're preventing spills, you're preventing exposure to extreme temperatures or water, the pesticide product and containers will stay intact and usable for a longer period of time, and they won't become waste. So I mentioned before, you do store pesticide waste with your pesticides, but mark them with for disposal, do not use, and keep them with the pesticides until you can dispose of them. With empty containers, you dispose of them in the trash or as directed by the label, but that's usually telling you to put them in the trash. Do not recycle them because they'll always have some pesticide residue, and that's not a good thing to put in with other recyclables. People who recycle plastics do not want the pesticide containers in with them. And also don't burn containers, excuse me, because any pesticide residue then will get in the smoke. You'll end up breathing the vapors and getting them in your eyes, and that's not a good thing. For damaged or unwanted product, you don't want to put those in the trash. Call your local solid waste department. They'll give you options to try to get rid of it. Maybe your town or county has a excuse me, have an occasional hazardous waste pickup day where you can bring things to that site. But again, those you don't want to put in the trash. And with that, I thank you. We have a fact sheet on storing pesticides at home. Here's the URL to get to our fact sheet page. And it has a lot of the information I just talked to you about. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. That's great information. One question that came in was, what is the typical shelf life of a pesticide when they're stored properly?
Again, that's very difficult to know. It's going to depend on the formulation. If you call the manufacturer, they might never be able to give you a good answer. What I always tell people is, if you buy pesticide in 2025 and use it in 2025, you'll be fine. You don't want to store it for long periods of time. The longer it's stored, the less effective it becomes. So I would say, again, just try to use something you're going to try to buy only as much as you're going to use up in the next 12 months. For things like lawn chemicals, just buy enough you're going to use this calendar year.
8. And if you are lucky enough to have one of those nice metal storage cabinets and you put your pesticide bottles in a separate plastic bin, like on a lower shelf, how would you feel about storing PPE on a higher shelf above the pesticides in the same cabinet?
I would still not do that. I'd keep PP maybe close by, maybe on top of the cabinet in a Tupperware, like a clear Tupperware with a lid on it. That'd be a better option than putting it inside the cabinet.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your slides, we're going to ask our next presenter to share her slides. So Susanna Crisco is an extension educator with the New York State Integrated Pest Management Program, and she specializes in IPM in housing. And so today she's going to be giving our IPM minute on how to avoid the misuse of mothballs. So go
Okay.
ahead, Susanna.
Okay. You can hear me, right? Okay. So let me get right into it because we only have a minute. Thank you, Matt and Amara, and thank you, Dan, for the great presentation. Mothballs, as the name sounds like, or moth flakes, crystals, or bars, or are pesticides labeled for use on surprise clothing moths and other fabric-eating pests. A lot of misconceptions. They're probably the most often misused pesticide, at least in my career working in housing. If you smell mothballs, if you're familiar with mothballs, you've probably experienced them being misused. You're not supposed to be smelling the mothballs if they're used correctly, but we'll get into that. They are not for spiders. They are not for snakes. Oh my gosh, everybody puts them around their house for snakes. This is a absolutely wrong misuse of this product. And they are not for used for repelling rodents. However, there are some products that are registered as rodent repellents that have the same active ingredient in them. But again, as Dan would remind us, the label is the law. If they are labeled for rodent repellent, they should be used for rodent repellents, and vice versa. If they're labeled for moths, they are not. They have a different label, different use, and different concentration. So what the critter that we're trying to target with mothballs, and they are effective, mothballs are effective if used properly, is the clothing moth. And there's a webbing clothes moth, and there's a case making clothes moth. Mothballs actually work by slowly giving off a toxic gas that kills the insects. So they go from solid to gas, and that word is a cool word called sublimate. They sublimate from a solid to a vapor, and so they are in fact a fumigant. It's a gas. So again, if you're smelling that gas, that vapor, you are you are exposed to the pesticide. So in my little research for, what products are out there that are labeled, mothballs, I found one on Amazon, and I clicked on the picture, and this was the description. This is not my text. This is a description that Amazon had. So mothballs are not used for rodents, but even the advertising, even the vendors are advertising them for rodents, which is absolutely wrong, right? The label, when you look up the actual label, it says that it's for killing clothes moths and carpet beetles. And I include a little picture of my favorite varied carpet beetle because they're pretty. But it's important to note what the label says. Kills moths and carpet beetles when used in airtight containers, right? And then the other thing on the label I want to bring your attention to is the high concentration of the chemical in these products. So a lot of pesticides have inert ingredients, inactive ingredients. This product is almost completely the chemical pesticide, paradichlorobenzene, 99.6%. So therefore, it is highly concentrated and is a risk for if someone were to ingest that, right? Hopefully not. Here's a clothing moth, a clothes moth. They generally attack things in storage. They're not going to start eating the sweaters in your closet that you're wearing regularly. It's the things that go in storage that they really tend to infest. So what are the environmental impacts and the health impacts? When you smell mothballs, you're inhaling one of these two insecticides, naphthalene, whole bunch of impacts from overexposure, and the EPA says naphthalene is a possible carcinogen. The other active ingredient in mothballs is paradichlorobenzene, which has similar health impacts. But it's used far more often because the EPA has now classified it as a not likely carcinogen, but the World Health Organization classified it as a possible carcinogen. Regardless, if you want more information on either of these two chemicals, you can go to the National Pesticide Information Center. Most of the time, exposure to these chemicals, overexposure, and these health impacts occur by just breathing in the vapors because of misuse, not using them in an enclosed space. Occasionally, poisoning happens through ingestion or through your skin. For example, if a baby was wearing something or had a blanket that was stored with mothballs, they may be exposed to it through their skin. Anyway, Poison Control Hotline is available for these types of cases. And also there is a pet poison hotline as well if a pet ingests a mothball. So proper use, enclosed airtight spaces, not plastic bags, not around food, and not outside as it degrades. Well, naphthalene has a short half-life, but even as they degrade, they can get into the soil, they can get into plants, can take them up, and they can get into water where they're toxic to fish. And then, of course, we're supposed to wash before wearing and don't mix different mothball types with different active ingredients. And as with any pesticide, we definitely have to read the label. Don't use anything that isn't labeled for carpet and upholstery. Could ruin it. And this is my last slide, just to be aware that there are alternatives. You can vacuum, launder, even just using the hot dryer, dry cleaning, and then storing things in a airtight container. You can, shake out or beat out rugs, small rugs. You can use the freezer. There are pheromone sticky traps. The one thing that you don't want to depend on, unfortunately, is cedar. Once that volatile oil evaporates, they aren't very effective. And that is all I have to say about mothballs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna, for that great and succinct presentation. We had one question about growing up with mothballs being used to protect clothing and concerns about long-term effects. I think the National Pesticide Information Center would be a good place to get answers about the chemicals in mothballs and health concerns there. Does that sound accurate?
Yes, so there is a lot of information on the National Pesticide Information Center's website. A lot of the health implications they list have are short-term impacts. There's not a lot known about there are a few cases where they had long-term impacts, and the long-term impacts can be anemia. So, if a child is exposed in particular.
Great, thank you. Thank you to both of our speakers for this great information. Please do go out and use pesticides more safely in this Pesticide Safety Education Month. And please do register for our upcoming What's Bugging You First Friday events for the rest of 2025. I dropped that link in the chat. If you registered for today's event, you'll get an email reminding you when the recording is available. And hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks so much.